Steam locomotives once demanded skills so specialized that mastering them took years of dangerous, hands-on training. But here is the thing. Every single one of these abilities is now completely useless. Today we are counting down 20 steam engineer skills that modern technology has rendered utterly obsolete. Ashpan dumping was the filthy finale to every locomotive run, a skill that separated experienced firemen from greenhorns. The ashpan sat beneath the firebox and collected the remnants of burned coal that fell through the grates. The technique required perfect timing and positioning. Dump too early while coals were still hot, and you risked starting trackside fires that could spread across dry terrain in minutes. Dump too late at the wrong location, and you violated railroad rules that specified exactly where ash could be deposited. The physical mechanics were deceptively simple, but they demanded situational awareness that took months to develop. The firemen operated dump doors using a lever in the cab, watching for designated ash pits or approved dumping zones while simultaneously monitoring steam pressure and water levels. Get it wrong and hot ash could damage track infrastructure or ignite nearby structures. In winter, ash would freeze inside the pan, requiring crews to chip away at compacted residue with iron bars while breathing in clouds of causite dust. Modern diesels produce no ash whatsoever. The skill of knowing when, where, and how to dump without creating hazards has vanished completely from railroading. Reading water glass fluctuations was perhaps the most critical survival skill any steam engineer could possess. The water glass showed the level over the crown sheet, the critical piece of metal that separates the firebox inferno from the boiler water. If that sheet became exposed, it would soften, collapse, and trigger a catastrophic boiler explosion. But reading the glass was not simply looking at a tube. Experienced engineers could detect problems by how the water moved. A bouncing level indicated priming when water was being carried over with the steam. A sluggish response suggested scale buildup, blocking the gauge connections. False readings from clogged ports could show adequate water when the crown sheet was actually exposed. Engineers developed an almost intuitive sense for these subtle behaviors, blowing down the gauge cocks regularly to verify accuracy. They learned to recognize that the glass showed what happened seconds ago, not what was happening now. Some could even predict when an injector would fail by watching how the water level responded to feeding. Today's electronic sensors provide instant, accurate readings with automatic warnings. The interpretive skill has been replaced by simple digital displays. Banking a fire was the overnight preservation technique that every roundhouse fireman mastered through careful practice. Banking kept locomotives ready for service without the long, expensive process of a cold restart. When a locomotive finished its run but needed to be ready for service the next morning, the fire couldn't simply be extinguished and relit. Cold starts on large boilers took 6 to 8 hours, consuming enormous amounts of coal just to reach operating pressure. The technique required spreading remaining coals evenly across the grate, then covering them with fresh coal that would slowly ignite throughout the night. Dampers and ashpan doors were adjusted to restrict airflow to precisely the right level. Too much air and the fire would burn too hot, wasting coal and potentially building dangerous pressure in an unattended boiler. Too little, and the fire would die, requiring that expensive cold start. Experienced bankers could judge by the color of smoke rising from the stack whether their fire would survive until morning. They developed an instinct for coal quality, adjusting technique based on whether they were working with anthracite or inferior lignite. Diesel locomotives require no overnight babysitting. Sandpipe operation for traction was the critical skill that prevented wheel slip on grades and in adverse conditions. Steam locomotives produced enormous torque that could easily overcome the friction between steel wheels and steel rails, especially when rails were wet or coated with frost. The engineer controlled sand delivery through a valve that released grit from dome-mounted containers through pipes aimed in front of each driving wheel. But effective sand use was far more nuanced than simply opening a valve. Too much sand wasted a limited resource and could actually reduce traction by creating a rolling layer beneath the wheels. Too little did nothing to prevent slipping. Experienced engineers learned to apply sand in precise bursts, timed to exhaust beats, delivering grit exactly when each wheel needed maximum adhesion. They developed an ear for the distinctive sound of slipping drivers, reacting with sand application and throttle reduction before wheel spin could accelerate dangerously. On long mountain grades, managing sand consumption became crucial. Run out before reaching the summit, and you might stall with a train that could not restart. Modern locomotives use computer-controlled traction systems that detect slip instantly. Fusible plug recognition was the last-ditch safety awareness that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. These small threaded plugs contained a core of low melting point alloy, typically a lead-tin mixture, and were screwed into the crown sheet where they were covered by water during normal operation. When water levels dropped dangerously low, exposing the plugs to firebox heat, the alloy would melt and release a jet of steam directly into the firebox. This wasn't a solution. It was a warning. Engineers had to recognize the distinctive sound and sight of a blown fusible plug instantly, then take immediate action to drop the fire before the crown sheet failed. The skill required knowing exactly where plugs were located on different locomotive types, and understanding that the warning might come when the engine was working hardest and crew attention was divided. Firemen learned to distinguish the hiss of a fusible plug from other steam leaks, a distinction that might take only seconds to make but could save lives. The responsibility weighed heavily. Ignore or misinterpret this signal, and the boiler might explode with lethal force. Modern locomotives have no crown sheets, no fusible plugs, and no need for this life-or-death vigilance. Blowdown valve operation was the unglamorous maintenance skill that prevented scale accumulation from destroying boiler efficiency. Boiler water contained dissolved minerals that precipitated out as scale when heated, coating tubes and reducing heat transfer dramatically. Regular blowdown removed concentrated sediments by expelling water and sludge from the lowest points in the boiler. The timing required judgment that came only through experience. Blow down too frequently, and you wasted heat, fuel, and water. Blow down too infrequently and scale would build up, insulating tubes until the locomotive could barely make steam. Engineers learned to recognize the signs of scale accumulation, from reduced steaming capacity to specific sounds as water circulated through partially blocked passages. The physical process demanded attention to pressure and water levels. Opening blowdown valves at full boiler pressure could damage the valves themselves or create dangerous steam discharge. Most engineers performed blowdown while stationary with reduced pressure, coordinating with the firemen to maintain safe water levels during the process. Different water qualities require different blowdown frequencies. Diesel engines require no such chemical management. Draft control with dampers was the airflow management skill that directly affected steaming capacity and fuel efficiency. The firebox required precise amounts of air to burn coal effectively. Too much air cooled the fire and wasted heat up the stack. Too little air produced incomplete combustion, creating smoke, clinkers, and deposits that choked the flue tubes. Dampers controlled this airflow through doors in the ashpan and adjustable openings that affected how exhaust draft pulled air through the fire. Mastering damper settings required understanding the relationship between locomotive speed, throttle position, and combustion requirements. At high speeds with full throttle, exhaust draft was strong and could pull too much air through the grate. Firemen would partially close dampers to optimize combustion. When standing still or moving slowly, exhaust draft weakened, requiring dampers to be opened wider or the blower to be engaged to maintain air supply. The interaction between dampers, blower, and firing technique was complex enough that experienced crews developed coordinated routines. Different coal qualities demanded different settings. Modern diesel engines manage their own combustion automatically through electronic fuel injection, requiring no operator input. Tender handbrake operation was the emergency stopping skill that every engineer prayed he would never need to use in earnest. When air brakes failed, Whether from a burst hose, frozen moisture in the lines, or mechanical breakdown, the train's momentum had to be controlled somehow. Tender brakes provided manual stopping power through a large wheel mounted on the tender deck that mechanically tightened brake shoes against the tender wheels. Operating this brake while moving required leaving the relative safety of the cab, climbing onto the swaying tender deck, and cranking the brake wheel while maintaining balance. In emergencies, this had to happen quickly, with full awareness of speed, grade, and distance to potential collision. The technique involved progressive application, tightening gradually to prevent wheel lockup that would create flat spots and reduce braking effectiveness. Engineers practiced this operation regularly, developing the muscle memory needed for rapid response. On some railroads, the tender brake served as the primary parking brake. The skill became critical during helper operations on steep grades, where runaway potential made emergency brake competence essential. Modern fail-safe air brake systems have made this manual backup obsolete. Calling signals was the verbal repetition ritual that prevented misread trackside indicators from causing disasters. As trains approached signal masts, the engineer would identify and announce the signal aspect aloud. The fireman was required to confirm by repeating the call, creating a double-check system that caught errors before they became accidents. This protocol demanded constant vigilance across shifts that might last 12 hours or more. Engineers developed the habit of scanning for signals continuously, calling them early enough to allow reaction time, while simultaneously managing throttle and brakes. The calls used standardized terminology that conveyed essential information about track conditions ahead. A clear signal meant proceed at authorized speed. An approach signal demanded preparation to stop. A stop signal required immediate cessation of movement. The skill extended beyond recognition to understanding what each signal meant for train handling. Calling an approach signal meant beginning brake application, coordinating with the fireman to avoid arriving at the next signal with excessive steam pressure. Modern cab signaling displays information directly in front of the engineer with automatic enforcement systems. Reversing lever manipulation was the cut-off adjustment skill that transformed raw steam power into efficient locomotive operation. The reversing lever, called the Johnson bar, controlled valve timing by changing when steam admission to the cylinders was cut off during each piston stroke. Full forward position meant maximum power with steam pushing the piston through most of its travel, consuming enormous amounts of steam. Shorter cutoffs used steam expansively, admitting it briefly, then allowing expansion to complete the work, improving fuel efficiency dramatically. Mastering the reversing lever required understanding exactly how cutoff affected power delivery. Starting a train demanded full gear. As speed increased, the engineer would notch back the lever, finding the sweet spot where the locomotive maintained speed with minimum steam. The skill involved constant adjustment based on grade, speed, load, and steam pressure. Working up a mountain required longer cutoffs despite the fuel penalty. Cresting and descending allowed shorter cutoffs or drifting with the throttle closed. Experienced engineers could feel through the lever how the locomotive responded, making fine adjustments that optimized performance. Diesel throttle notches provide fixed power levels. Injector priming was the temperamental art that kept water flowing into the boiler against its own pressure. The injector used steam to force cold water into the boiler, a seemingly impossible feat that defied intuitive physics. But getting an injector to work was not as simple as opening valves. The device had to be primed, a delicate sequence of partially opening steam and water valves, until the injector caught and began its characteristic singing hum. Get the sequence wrong, and the injector would refuse to pick up, spitting water from its overflow while the boiler level dropped dangerously. Experienced firemen developed an almost musical sense for injector operation, feeling through the controls when the device was about to catch or fail. Different injector designs required different techniques. Some wanted steam first, others water. Temperature mattered too. Hot feed water from a heated tender could prevent an injector from working entirely. Track vibration could knock an injector off, requiring immediate attention to restart it before the boiler ran dry. The 1913 IE Skill disaster killed 14 people, partly because a malfunctioning injector distracted the crew. Modern locomotives use electric pumps that work reliably regardless of conditions. Water scoop operation was the high-speed refueling skill that allowed express trains to run hundreds of miles without stopping. Track pans, long troughs of water laid between the rails, provided water that locomotives could scoop up at speed using a deployable pipe beneath the tender. The fireman controlled the scoop through a lever, lowering it into the trough as the train approached and raising it before the tender overflowed. The timing was critical. Lower too early and the scoop would strike the track. Lower too late and you would miss the pan entirely. The optimal speed was around 45 miles per hour, but express trains often scooped at 70 miles per hour or higher. At those speeds, water rushed into the tender with tremendous force, creating massive spray that soaked everything nearby. Passengers in the first coach learned to close windows when approaching track pans. Firemen learned to watch the water level indicator and raise the scoop the instant the tender was full, or face a deluge that flooded the cab. Winter operations added another challenge, as track pans could freeze solid. Modern diesel locomotives carry enough fuel to run thousands of miles without any trackside infrastructure. Clinker hookwork was the brutal physical skill of cleaning a fire while the locomotive was still steaming. Clinkers, fused masses of ash and slag, formed when impurities in coal melted together on the grates. Left alone, they blocked airflow and killed the fire. Removing them required inserting a long iron hook through the fire door into the inferno of the firebox, locating the clinker by feel through the tool, breaking it free from the grates, and dragging it out without scattering burning coals across the cab floor. The heat was intense enough to singe hair and eyebrows from several feet away. Experienced firemen developed techniques for working quickly, minimizing exposure while ensuring complete removal. They learned to identify clinker formation by changes in fire behavior, addressing problems before they became severe. The physical demands were enormous. Clinker hooks weighed several pounds and had to be manipulated precisely in three-dimensional space, while the locomotive swayed and pitched. Some clinkers weighed 30 pounds or more and had to be broken into pieces for removal. Modern diesels produce no combustion byproducts that require manual removal. Whistle code fluency was the communication skill that coordinated train movements before radio existed. Steam whistles were not just warning devices. They were a complete language with standardized patterns of long and short blasts that conveyed specific messages. 2 long blasts meant the train was releasing the brakes and moving forward. 3 short blasts meant the train was backing up. 1 long blast followed by 3 short blasts called for the flagman. 4 long blasts signaled the train was approaching a station. The famous pattern, long, long, short, long, warned of grade crossings. Engineers memorized dozens of these codes and could exchange complex information with other trains, station agents, and track workers using nothing but steam and sound. The skill extended beyond mere memorization to artful execution. Experienced engineers developed personal styles of blowing the whistle, a technique called quilling that varied tone and timing to create distinctive sounds. Railroad employees could identify individual engineers by their whistle style alone. The whistle also served as emotional expression, with mournful tones for funerals and exuberant blasts for celebrations. Radio communication has replaced this elaborate acoustic language entirely. Running board oiling was a death-defying maintenance skill, performed while locomotives were in motion. Steam engines had dozens of lubrication points that required regular attention, many located along the running boards that stretched from the cab to the smoke box. Before mechanical lubricators became standard, firemen or engineers had to climb out of the cab while the train was moving, walk along the narrow running boards beside the boiling hot boiler, and apply oil to bearings, valve gear, and other components using long-spouted oil cans. The hazards were extreme and ever-present. Running boards were often slippery with oil, water, and coal dust. The locomotive swayed and pitched unpredictably on imperfect track. One misstep meant falling beneath the wheels or onto the adjacent track where another train might be passing. Summer heat made the boiler jacket hot enough to cause severe burns on contact. Winter cold made metal surfaces treacherous with ice. Yet this dangerous task had to be performed multiple times during long runs to prevent bearing seizures and mechanical failures that could strand the train. Automatic mechanical lubricators eventually eliminated this hazardous practice entirely from regular locomotive operations. Spot firing technique was the precision coal placement skill that maintained an even, efficient fire throughout a locomotive's run. Firemen did not simply shovel coal into the firebox randomly. Each scoop had to land in a specific location to maintain a level firebed with consistent thickness across the entire grate. The technique was called firing light and often meant placing small amounts precisely rather than dumping large loads haphazardly. The firemen aimed for thin spots, areas where the coal had burned down, building the bed evenly while avoiding thick spots that would starve the fire of air and create smoke. The real challenge was reading the fire through the blinding glare of the open door, identifying where coal was needed in the seconds available before intense heat forced the door closed again. Different locomotive designs required different firing patterns. Wide fireboxes needed coal thrown to the corners with strong arm motions. Long, narrow boxes required reaching the far end without building up the front. Wind conditions affected where coal would land, as drafts pulled lighter pieces off course. Modern diesel engines require no such careful manual fuel distribution whatsoever. Blower valve management was the artificial draft skill that kept fires burning when natural exhaust draft failed. When a locomotive stood still or coasted with the throttle closed, no exhaust steam passed through the smoke box to create the draft that pulled air through the fire. Without intervention, the fire would suffocate and die. The blower valve admitted live steam to the smoke box through a ring of jets, creating artificial draft that maintained combustion during these critical periods. But blower use consumed steam without producing any useful work, draining the boiler during the very moments when no steam was being generated to replace it. Skilled engineers learned to use the blower sparingly, applying just enough draft to keep the fire alive without wasting precious steam reserves. The timing of blower application during station stops, grade descents, and slow orders required anticipating what the locomotive would need in the minutes ahead. Too much blower, and you would arrive at the next grade with a depleted boiler. Too little, and the fire would die, requiring time-consuming rebuilding. Diesel locomotives have no fires to maintain and require no such draft management. Priming prevention was the boiler management skill that kept water out of the cylinders, where it could cause catastrophic damage. Priming occurred when water was carried over with steam into the dry pipe and down to the cylinders. Unlike steam, water does not compress. When a cylinder full of water tried to complete its stroke, something had to give, usually the cylinder head, piston rod, or connecting rod. The results were spectacular mechanical failures that could sideline a locomotive instantly. Firemen learned to prevent priming by maintaining proper water levels, avoiding sudden throttle movements that could slosh water into the steam space, and recognizing the warning signs of impending carryover. The sound changed subtly when water entered the steam. The locomotive's exhaust took on a wet quality. Experienced crews could detect these changes and respond by closing the throttle and opening cylinder cocks to drain accumulated water before damage occurred. Water treatment also mattered, as foaming from contaminated water could cause false readings and promote priming. Modern locomotives have no boilers, no priming risk, and no need for this constant mechanical vigilance. Cylinder cock operation was the moisture management skill that prevented hydraulic lock from destroying engine components. Steam condensed inside cold cylinders, and this water had to be expelled before applying power. Cylinder cocks, small valves on each cylinder end, allowed accumulated water to drain. Engineers opened these cocks when starting from cold, when drifting downgrade with the throttle closed, and whenever condensation might have accumulated. The skill lay in knowing when water might be present and ensuring it was expelled before opening the throttle. The consequences of failure were immediate and expensive. A cylinder full of water, subjected to piston pressure, could blow out cylinder heads, bend piston rods, or crack the cylinder casting itself. Experienced engineers listened for the telltale spray of water and steam from open cocks, closing them only when the discharge turned to pure dry steam. Cold weather intensified the challenge, as condensation formed rapidly in chilled metal. Long periods of drifting down mountains required periodic cock opening to clear accumulated moisture even while moving. Diesel engines have no steam, no condensation, and no cylinder cocks to manage. The complete art of reading locomotive behavior through sound, vibration, and intuition represents the most profound lost skill of the steam era. Master engineers did not just operate their locomotives, they listened to them, felt them, and understood them as living machines with individual personalities. Every steam engine was different, with its own quirks, preferences, and warning signs. Engineers learned to detect bearing problems by subtle changes in rhythm, boiler issues by variations in steam quality, and valve timing problems by exhaust irregularities. They could feel through the throttle lever whether the locomotive was working efficiently or struggling. The creak of expanding metal told them about temperature distribution. The pitch of the exhaust revealed cut-off position and steam flow. This holistic awareness developed over years of experience, creating an almost telepathic connection between operator and machine. Old engineers spoke of locomotives as partners rather than tools, understanding their moods and needs. When steam gave way to diesel, this intimate mechanical communion vanished entirely. Modern locomotive operation requires monitoring instruments and following procedures. The profound skill of truly knowing a machine has become utterly obsolete. And that's all, folks. 20 skills that once defined railroad professionalism now exist only in memory and museum demonstrations. Subscribe for more forgotten railroad history. Here's another video I've specially selected for you. See you next time.